Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Bacetta, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. You can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on influencers, or as I get the sense, they're being more and more called creators. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on micro creators or micro influencers. And these are people who have between, let's say, 1,000 and 20,000 followers. So they're not capital I influencers in the sense that we think of really influential people online, but rather these are more of people who have some sort of legitimacy or respect within their particular community. So you, dear listener, may also be a micro influencer. And my guest to discuss this is Ryan Davis. He is the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of People First, which is an agency that connects political campaigns and advocacy groups with these micro creators. And Ryan has a really strong track record of digital-first approaches to campaigning and organizing, going back to the Howard Dean campaign in 2004, the Obama campaign in 2008, and later having worked for Blue State Digital. So he is a great person to share with us what is going on with micro creators in the context of political campaigns. I also want to mention that this idea of the micro influencer, we first talked about 6 years ago in 2018 on episode 46 with Tom Lillywhite. So what's fascinating is to see how this idea of peer-to-peer persuasion, or not focusing at the top of the creator ladder, but moving more towards more authentic and low followership influence, is not a new idea, but we are seeing it start to be professionalized in a way that I hope you get a sense of through this episode. And what I find fascinating is the sophistication and the data-driven approaches to recruiting, but also analyzing the effects of these micro creators. So there's a lot in store in this interview. If you're interested in influencers and creators, this is the state of the art and how they are being used in modern day campaigns. For example, one thing we'll talk about in the interview that I thought was super fascinating is the idea of creator whitelisting, where you have the creator register as a political advertiser with Meta, and then they can produce their own piece of content, but it's actually the campaign that is uploading a list and deciding who to target with that message. So you have an organic piece of content from the creator, but actually the targeting is being decided by the campaign in paid partnership with the influencer. So really interesting stuff. I'll put in the episode description a list of links on things that Ryan and his co-founder have written about influencers. So if you want to get up to speed really quick, you can take a look at those resources. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Ryan Davis. Again, he is the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder at People First, and also hosts a travel podcast called Out of Office. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Ryan, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Michael. I appreciate it.
So to start out here, why don't you introduce us to People First and the work you've been doing around political influencers? We've had a couple interviews already with agencies working with content creators on the American left, but what sets People First apart?
So People First launched about 5 years ago. We had a focus on disinformation repair, but we quickly found out that while everybody thinks disinformation is a sexy topic, nobody has any money to do anything about it. But everyone was interested in the other half of the business, which was getting real people to talk about issues and to push back on bad narratives. And so people basically started coming to us for this micro-influencer work. And so about 3 years ago, we pivoted entirely to focus specifically on creators. And I think what sets us apart a bit is that, I come from a political organizing background. I was on the Dean campaign and the Obama campaign, and I brought that sort of ethos to People First. So while we have a really cool technology that helps us, identify creators and ingest a lot of data, we have a lot of humans who are digital relational organizers who go out into the wilds of the internet and find the exact kind of people that a campaign or an advocacy group wants to work with. So if you're looking for Native Americans to talk about the importance of public lands in Montana, that's something that we can do. And if you're looking for single moms in Atlanta to help get out the vote, that's something we can do. So I think one of the things that I don't like about influencer marketing is that it's largely, a self-selected group of people who participate, who want to be capital I influencers. And these folks tend to, come from the coast, share a lot of demographic similarities. And what we're trying to do is, diversify all that. And we believe that the influencers an organization works with should look like the audience that they're trying to influence.
Interesting. Well, let's pick up on this idea of micro influencers or micro creators. And I've been reading that you've been writing a lot of pieces on this and arguing that these micro creators offer a sort of different dynamic than traditional celebrities or content creators with larger audiences. So can you outline what these micro creators are and how they differ from more classic campaign surrogates like celebrities?
Yeah, so when we think of like micro creators, micro influencers, nano influencers, whatever you want to call them, we're generally thinking about folks who have between 2 and 20,000 followers. And these folks are not famous. They're not Justin Bieber or Lady Gaga, but they are, community validators. And in their specific niche or in their specific geographic region, they're pretty well known. So they might be teachers or nurses or pastors or, people with a public platform in their city or town. And, these folks share much stronger ties to their followers than influencers. And their followers tend to be more local. They tend to overlap a lot with the demographics and affinities of the creator. And, they're not people who are out there making their living like Mr. Beast producing content. They have like a normal 9 to 5, and they might produce content on the side for fun, or they might make content about their specific niche or interest. So these are the folks that we think are, much more likely to be impactful to their audiences. And some other benefits really are, you get the rights to all the content. So we're often getting our creators to, use the paid partnership tag so we can boost their content directly from their profiles. So instead of the ad coming from the Human Rights Campaign, it comes from @Michael. And it just feels so much more personal or authentic when you're doing it that way. And, we'll even work with creators to get them through that. We in the US here, we have this Meta authorization process for somebody to be allowed to place a political ad on the Meta platform, whether it be Facebook or Instagram or one-day threads. And we'll work with creators to get them through that process so they can actually participate and boost their content directly from a political side too. So that's where I think these micro creators are they're more interesting, they're more niche, and you're getting a great piece of content that speaks to your target audience.
Yeah, and I want to come back more to that idea of the kind of connection between the influencer and the advocacy or political campaign a bit later. But you've also mentioned in a white paper that People First published about very concrete benefits and measurable benefits in terms of things like cost per engagement and earned media. So can you tell us about some of the internal research you've been doing and what you found out about the effectiveness of these micro-influencers?
Yeah, the engagement rates and the cost per engagement when you're working with a micro creator are just much better than influencers, capital I influencers, folks who have over, let's say 300, 400,000 followers. And that's because, people follow these capital I influencers, these celebrities in a more aspirational way, but they don't see themselves generally in these creators that they're following. Where like a micro influencer, this is somebody that you could go to church with, have gone to school with, you might work with, or at least is somebody who would remind you of one of those people. So it's a way to sort of substitute what would be sort of the weak ties of following a larger creator where they've got, their life and their lifestyle is definitely more aspirational versus somebody who you're really connected to. So we see a lot of benefits on the paid media side and the organic engagement side. And the positivity of the engagement is also something that you see. So we'll often ingest all the comments on any given post and look for themes and sentiment. And when we're dealing with a larger creator, people are just much more likely to be mean, to be negative, because they don't have any real ties to these folks. Versus if you're working with a nurse from Atlanta, people are just way less likely to get personal and to be negative in the comments, even when the content is scaled. So we see scaling these micro influencers as a great way to create positive engagement tell a positive story, and I think run less risk of, getting more negative comments from a larger creator.
Interesting about this idea of tone and sentiment. Is it that when you partner with one of these influencers, when you say ingest the comments, is that because you are sort of connected to their account, as you're mentioning with the paid partnership, so then you can actually harvest that data computationally, or is this something you're just looking at more qualitatively?
So we're ingesting a lot of data. The technologies that we've built basically allows us to ingest data from the public internet. So one of the things that we do is when we're working with the creator, we ingest all those comments, both to look for the sentiment, to report back to clients. Are people asking questions about where to vote? Are they raising flags around a certain issue, et cetera? But also, for organizing leads, maybe somebody who's commented is a kind of person we should work with on the campaign or on another campaign. So we're constantly sort of pulling in that data to both to expand our database and to give our organizers more things to work with, as well as sort of inform the narrative of the campaign. So when we work with creators, we give them a creative brief. And that brief is basically an outline of the organization, the goals of the campaign, what they should talk about, what they shouldn't talk about, what the disclosures are to be, FTC and FEC compliant, et cetera. So we might change that creative brief if we start seeing in the comments a lot of negativity around a certain issue or very specific questions coming up again and again. We go, okay, that's something that we want creators to address in the original piece of content. So we're using that information to sort of constantly optimize the messaging of the campaign.
Interesting. We've heard that on the show some time ago, that the qualitative aspect of those comments is often overlooked. There's good insights there. So I think it's a smart strategy to optimize on them. But before we dive more specifically into kind of working with micro creators, why don't we look at some examples? I saw that People First recently won a Reed Award for Best Influencer Marketing for a Political Campaign. So could you tell us a little bit about that campaign and how creators were used as part of a broader digital and kind of overall communication strategy?
Yeah, so we worked with Governor Andy Beshear in Kentucky. And, Kentucky is not a state that you think about when you think about influencers. It's a more rural state. It's not as digital forward as, like a New York or a California or Washington state. So we went out there and we recruited a lot of folks who, because for Governor Beshear to win the state of Kentucky, he's got to win over moderates. He's got to win folks who vote Republican in federal elections. So we wanted to find people who would sort of normalize that behavior, say, hey, I might not be the most liberal guy in the world, but I like Governor Beshear. And so, finding coal miners, farmers, teachers and nurses, we always love working with, truck drivers, but people who you don't think of when you think of influencers necessarily to create that content. And then the campaign took that content and they used it on their organic social channels. They can use it in paid media, boost it to very specific groups. So, if you're looking to talk to, white men who live in rural Kentucky, we recruit a few of those men. You take that content and you basically put it up against the voter file. So you're normalizing that behavior. These guys are seeing that, it's okay to vote for Governor Beshear. Or, my friends or people in the community are also doing it. So it gives it that really unique take. And that was a fun campaign. It's a hard campaign because Kentucky's a harder state to organize in than some of the work we did. And I think that's probably why the Reeds recognized it.
Interesting. So I was thinking, one of the questions I had for you was exactly about influencer targeting, because we often think about, at least in academia, or probably a little bit behind campaigns, but, platform targeting where you're using the platform's categorizations to target versus list targeting where you upload the voter file. And so one of the things I was thinking is that if you have influencers or micro creators and your internal data shows that people who follow these micro creators tend to be in the same state and they tend to have a similar profession. So I thought just having those influencers deliver a message would be a form of targeting. But it sounds like from what you're saying is that you're actually using platform or list targeting through the creator's account. So could you discuss that dynamic of how you would target with an influencer?
Yeah, so we're doing both those things. I mean, we're certainly trying to recruit creators who, match the demographics and the geography that we're trying to influence, because those folks are more likely to have followers who match those. But, when you're talking about micro creators, they've got 3, 4, 5, 6,000 followers, that's not going to deliver your message at scale. But what gets really interesting is when you get a nice slice of the voter file working with an organization like TargetSmart or L2, that matches the demographics of the creators, and then you scale that content with one-to-one match. So it's actually showing that truck driver who lives in rural Kentucky to other rural folks who are moderates or independents in the state of Kentucky. And that's really valuable. And you do have to go that extra mile where you're getting that truck driver to, go to the notary and prove that they live in the US, and filling out that meta form and all that stuff. And it's not easy to convince creators that give Mark Zuckerberg their driver's license or their passport. So that's something that we have to have a lot of trust. And I think having the real people that we have, the real organizers who are working with these folks, and not just some kind of faceless platform that they're putting their content into, it makes it easier to do that. But I definitely think of it in both ways. The targeting is organic, and then when you boost it, I think there's a lot of magic in that.
And is this what I was reading your white paper and came across this idea of creator whitelisting? Is this what whitelisting is, when you exactly give that driver's license and have them verified so that there can be list integration boosting from that creator's account?
That's exactly it. Yeah. And in the non-political world, in the brand world, this goes on all the time. It's super simple. You just use the paid partnership tag. There's no need to go through the big meta authorization process. But for the political work, if you're using that disclaimer, and I think some of your listeners, might know how annoying meta is. And, they have to be. Obviously, it's important to make sure that the folks who are buying ads are who they say they are. But it's just a lot of little things you have to do to make sure that ad gets approved, and you can boost it to your audience. But, another thing you can do is you can take that content. We were just up in New Hampshire with a campaign reminding non-affiliated voters that they could vote in the Republican primary. We had a belief that unaffiliated voters would be more likely to support Ambassador Haley over Trump. And so we were working with an organization that wanted to get the vote out with independents. So we recruited a bunch of independents to make videos saying, hey, I'm an independent, but I'm going to vote in the Republican primary. And then it was too late for us to get these folks through the meta authorization process, because that takes 2 or 3 weeks. So we actually put that up on programmatic and streaming. So we had these videos that were sort of TikTok-y, Instagram reel feel, that were popping up when people were watching their smart TV, also targeted to the voter file. So we're big believers in, when you're watching something on Amazon and the ad comes up and it's just sort of a standard 15-second ad that, it was beautifully produced in a studio, and you kind of tune out while you're waiting for it to be over, versus an ad pops up and it looks like a TikTok video, and it's somebody that it could be your neighbor talking to you about getting out to vote. It's a much different experience. And we had, I think, a lot of success reaching that audience through the programmatic buy.
Interesting, because, we've heard on this show about how if campaigns have the budget, they will put it towards streaming TV or programmatic advertising. But I think the idea was that the reason is that because people are perhaps tuned in with the sound on, they want to get to the next content, right? It's a form of forced exposure. But what you're saying is that you're actually putting more social media type content onto streaming TV so that it creates this kind of, I guess, contrast where what you'd expect to see on your phone is what you're seeing on your TV, and that draws attention. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the research is still out, right? Like, this is such a new tactic that we don't have a ton of data, but we do see incredibly high video completion rates and, pretty strong engagement from some of these ads. And I think that if you create an unexpected moment, it kind of gets people's attention when they might just kind of, be going to refill their glass of wine or something. So,
I mean, it totally makes sense, but it's blowing my mind now that, TikToks are showing up on my Facebook, and now they're going to show up on my TV too. I mean, yeah, it makes sense. They seem to work across all platforms.
Yeah, I mean, I came of age politically in the Dean campaign, so I've always been sort of like a digital first campaigner. And, I have friends who work in TV and probably, won't love me saying this, but I think that TV's become a much more sort of passive way that folks experience media. And if you can, use that content to sort of break them out of their passivity, if you can do innovative things in like YouTube pre-roll or in an ad that pops up in a video game, these are just places where people are kind of like slightly more engaged than they are when they're kind of sitting back and watching 2.5 Men reruns.
Definitely. Well, let's turn over a bit to TikTok, because one of the questions I had about exactly this kind of influencer targeting was that my impression is that, or at least coming into this interview, was that influencers are valuable on TikTok because they get around the platform's kind of advertising ban, right? You can't officially do this type of whitelisting through TikTok, as far as I know, because you're not allowed to advertise politically on the platform. So then the value of influencers would be that they're the only way you can sort of advertise or target on TikTok. But it seems like there also are much more mechanical ways on Meta. So is the value of micro creators on a platform like TikTok more that they're the only game in town to get your political content out if it's not coming from your account? Or how do you see that kind of structural limitation?
Yeah, so I think TikTok is a super important platform, and campaigns and advocacy groups ignore it at their peril, right? It's a place where under 30s are highly engaged. And, when you start to look at the demographic breakdown of TikTok, it more and more is becoming a place where, older folks are also hanging out. I'm 42, I'm on TikTok, and not just because I have to be for work. So it's super important. And the conversations that are happening on TikTok, I think, are very similar to the conversations I saw on Twitter 10 years ago. So, it used to be that Twitter would drive sort of the media narrative. And so something would trend on Twitter and it would end up on CNN. And now it's really like these TikTok conversations are starting to drive the media narrative. And so if you're not playing on TikTok, if you're not creating content there, you're basically letting what's being discussed be up to entirely to the users. And it's important to, because of the advertising restrictions on TikTok, to try to work with as many creators as you can to kind of decentralize your message and get it out on the platform. The discovery tool is really powerful. The way that content is surfaced on TikTok is really unique to TikTok. And I see political communications as kind of like a war of attrition. So if my opponent puts out 5,000 messages and I put out 500 messages, like no matter how beautiful those 500 ads I put out, I'm just going to be overwhelmed and swamped by my opponent, who has gotten way more messages out and way more decentralized, and it feels much more organic that way. And, TikTok's a really interesting platform where I think you can work with creators to, if I'm a campaign and I'm putting out like branded campaign content, I can have creators like do things like stitch and collab on TikTok to like reach their audiences with my content and comment on it, et cetera. So I think there's clever ways that you can kind of integrate creators into like a more branded strategy on TikTok to give it that more decentralized feel.
Definitely. And I think, just recently, Instagram is kind of moving in a similar direction, right? Where they're downranking exposure of political content in feeds unless you actively opt in to turn that on or are already following political accounts. And so I guess what I'm kind of getting at is the value of influencers. We hear a lot about the parasocial relationships or the fact that they are so authentic, but then there's also this very sort of structural reason for them to carry a political message, to get around a political ad ban or to like boost content through their account. So are both just equally valuable, the relationship and their kind of structural utility, or is one tipping more towards persuasiveness or mobilization than the other?
Well, I think that with the political changes that Meta announced and that have gone into effect, like it's more important than ever to decentralize your message, because now if you're posting from, at Barack Obama on Instagram, it's only going to be seen by, the folks who follow at Barack Obama. So if you want to decentralize that message, you need to work with a bunch more voices who have followers who don't overlap with Obama. And one of the mistakes I see campaigns and organizations make is just working with like the usual suspects and people who are speaking to the folks who would opt in to political content on Meta. And if you're one of the folks who is going to opt into political content on Meta, that's telling me that you're probably not that persuadable, And so my interest would be, and how we win elections in the US is getting to that 20 or 30% of the electorate who is not a true blue or a true red voter and is willing to be persuaded about an issue or about a candidate. And I don't think you do that by, working with creators who are talking about politics all the time, because their audience is following them so they can feel good about, what they believe and get that social cachet from like agreeing with the creator. And we find that if you're working with somebody who doesn't talk about politics very often, when they do talk about politics, it makes a real mark, and that engagement's really high, and it's not something that their followers necessarily expect. So I think the benefits are both ways. It's tough to say which one's more important, but It's all part of why I think influencer this cycle is becoming something that everybody's talking about. Look, like 4 years ago, Michael, when I would meet with campaigns and PACs, I would have to spend a lot of time convincing them that influencer was important. And this cycle, that is not the case. They all know that they want to have an influencer program. They don't know how they should structure it, but they know that it's something they should be doing. And that's a major change from 4 years ago.
Definitely. And there's something you said there I want to pick up on, which is about this idea of when a creator is not political, but then sort of works with a campaign or group to then become political. You said it sort of makes a mark. And I'm curious about that from kind of two sides. One is, as we were talking about before, these posts might have this paid partnership tag, kind of like how we see on Facebook with a sponsored for an ad. And if the influencer is a micro influencer, maybe doesn't do a lot of paid partnerships, that might be something that's new. And then, of course, the political part might be something that's new. And I'm just wondering how you sort of coach influencers up to prepare for any potential negative backlash of either kind of being perceived to sell out on the advertising side or to sort of be political, or is it, in your experience, that that's received positively?
It really depends on the campaign. And, we can actually tell, not in a way that we can quantify exactly, but when I'm working with my organizers and we're looking at email open rates and SMS responses and the people who are getting back to us and converting, I have a gut feeling how well that campaign is doing, right? Like, if it's really, really hard to find people that want to talk about you publicly, it's not a great sign for a campaign. But if we see a campaign where a lot of people want to opt in and more people want to opt in than we even have space for, you get the feeling that there's something going on and there's some organic excitement about the candidate. We do, work with creators. We give them like Q&A docs about how to deal with trolls, and we give them recommendations on what to do about negative comments, et cetera. But those haven't really changed since I was thinking about community management in 2004, right? Like, you don't feed the trolls, you don't engage with people who are clearly not trying to have a real conversation, but are just trying to bait you. When you're working with like a micro creator, you've got sort of a community of followers that are sort of self-policing. So, they tend to be just more fair than they would be if it was a big brand or a capital I influencer like Mr. Beast, where there's plenty of people who follow him just to be negative. We definitely work with the creators. We've worked on issues in states like women's rights issues and women's health issues and red states where the creators have taken like real flack for speaking out. But in a lot of those cases, the creators are, they're doing it not just for the payment, but they're doing it because they care about the issue and they hadn't thought about how they could use their platform before. So, we've had creators who we've had to have comments turned off and things like that. But it doesn't happen as often as you would think.
Interesting. And I want to get into we've been talking so much about the sending side. I want to get into your work in actually recruiting these micro creators. You mentioned a sort of technical way to do that. But first, I think it's interesting that you mentioned how you can sort of gauge how a campaign is going, whether it's kind of, generating signups, maybe monitoring the online chatter a little bit. Is that something that you might go to a creator with in trying to get them to work with you? Like, hey, we have all these indicators that there's a lot of interest in your state around this, a lot of positive interest. This might be something good for you to post about. Or is that sort of somehow worked in as a way to feed some quantitative data to convince these influencers to go political?
It almost always gets easier when you start recruiting the first few pieces, because you've got, I can say, hey, I know that you're a rural guy who lives in Kentucky, but let me share Bill's video that went live last week, and you can see the response to it. That makes people feel more comfortable, especially if they haven't done a paid campaign before, So we definitely use successful content as a way to sort of get more creators interested. And we also go back to campaigns with things that we hear from creators. Like, I'm not going to say what campaign it is, we're working on a bunch this cycle, but the war in Gaza, the Israeli-Gaza war right now is making it more difficult to recruit younger creators for Democratic candidates. And we flagged this to several campaigns, and we said, hey, this is something that the candidate should probably figure out a way to address. Obviously, it's a massively complicated thing to address, and we're not telling them something that they don't know, but we're getting direct feedback from young creators who, have previously expressed positive sentiments around Democratic candidates and are now not doing that. And that to me is a red flag.
But an interesting way to source some input for the campaign at a different, a different data type than we might expect.
Well, one of the things we do that's kind of fun is these creator panels. So we might recruit 5 suburban women in Wisconsin and not focus group them about what they think as much as focus group them about what has been an effective way to reach their followers, and then use that information and that kind of spin as we create the creative briefs for a campaign to reach those women. So, focus groups are very much like, what do people think? But these creator panels are very much like, what have you seen be effective in rallying your audience to XYZ calls? And you get some interesting findings.
I bet. But I want to pick up on a piece that your partner and co-founder, Curtis Hoagland, wrote about influencers and mentioned the amount of work and the amount of steps that goes into actually recruiting one of these micro creators. For example, identifying, credentialing, recruiting, negotiating, managing, approving, and then distributing content. So I'm curious if you could go into a bit that sort of back end side of actually identifying and then recruiting these micro creators.
Yeah, so, I'm a firm believer, like I said earlier, that there isn't just a technical solution to this. So we have a technology that identifies folks who are in specific states or congressional districts who are perhaps having conversations about the issue or that we think would have an affinity based on who they follow to the issue. And then we build basically organizing lists. And then we have a team of organizers who go out and have conversations with these folks. If they're talking to Gen Z, it might be via DM initially. If they're talking to, folks in their 30s or 40s, that it might be an email. With our senior creators, we've done work with like the Ad Council and AARP, where we've worked with creators over 55. That might be getting them on the phone to talk to somebody. It's real organizing, like it's not that much different than when I was in Saluda, South Carolina during the 2008 primary, making phone calls on behalf of Obama. So you find those folks, you speak with them, you tell them about the campaign at a high level. If they gauge interest, you then move into sort of giving them more information about the campaign. And then on the other end of that, we're making sure that, there's nothing in their content that would be a flag for the campaign or the brand that we're working with. So we're looking for, extreme political views, any sexist, homophobic, racist comments that they might have made. It's a lot of work to make sure that the creator is not going to have something that they've posted that would embarrass or would be off message for the campaign. And then the collaboration process can take a long time with a new creator. We generally allow 2 to 3 rounds of feedback because, the first video might just be, completely off, not in message, but maybe they filmed it in a weird way or the audio isn't good. And so there's a lot of hand-holding with these creators to get the content up to a standard that we think is still authentic, but is, professional enough to play well on the platforms. And then, the client has a feedback round and then the content goes live. And then we do the sort of reporting on how that content performed organically. And we decide if it should be part of a paid media program or should be repurposed on the brand channels or put in an email. What happens to the content after it goes live is a whole other story.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I've heard before that one of the strategies that in working with political creators is to sort of give them space to do their own type of content because they kind of know what works and they know what best fits their brand. But it's interesting that and it makes total sense that there is this kind of a little bit of risk management from the campaign side in terms of making sure that it somehow fits the overall message or brand of the campaign.
Yeah, you've definitely, I'm a big believer in, not being overly specific with how the message is given. What are the things they can say and what are the things they shouldn't say, that kind of stuff. But, you're working with them because they know how to communicate with their audience. So when you're overly prescriptive, you get dull content or content that just feels like they're reading from a script. That's just not the most effective stuff. And it's a lot of like working with the clients to kind of understand that they can release a little bit of their control. They're used to working with like a Blue State Digital, like where I came from, where they're getting scripts, so they're getting very specific, exactly what they expect deliverables. And to let go a little bit of that creative control, it takes a little leap of faith on the client side, but then they get more comfortable with it as they start to see what the content looks like, and that process becomes easier.
So my next question, this is a bit of a strange question maybe, but I was just thinking about this idea of micro creators. And of course, the line between nano and micro and macro, it's sort of Yeah, it's not set in stone, but I am wondering about kind of looking into the future a bit, thinking about, if these micro creators, presumably they are trying to grow their audience, even if it is just, a part-time thing. But is there a risk that if they get more popular and get more followers and sort of get into the next level of influencership, are they perhaps less useful for a campaign? Like, in a sense, they may grow out of being a micro influencer. Is that something that you have thought about, or are you more just focused on the here and now?
Well, I think that's why we're constantly organizing. So when you work with us on a campaign, you might get a creator or two that we've worked with in the past. We have a big database. We have a creator portal where we post projects that fit for certain creators. But we're always bringing in new creators because they feel less stale. They've done less brand work or maybe no brand work in the past. So the way that I see it, there are like 280 million American adults or something like that who are online, and all those folks are ripe for a project if they're fit for it. So we haven't hit the bottom of the barrel yet, but so we've got a little time, I think.
Interesting. So wrapping up here, I wanted to ask you, because as you mentioned a few times, you have a breadth of experience working with innovative campaigns. I mean, going back to Howard Dean, which in academia is seen as this like prototype campaign for harvesting the power of the internet and Netroots Nation and all of those things. But then I think also about the creator economy and the idea that people are posting less. So even if there are 280 million Americans, there's not many that are actually posting and trying to really cultivate this audience. Most consumers have become passive. And so I'm wondering, how do you see that from a democratic perspective, especially in terms of organizing? Is it a net positive for democracy that these people who are investing online are reaping the rewards and can become potential influencers when it comes to political messaging?
It's funny because if you asked 21-year-old Ryan on the Dean campaign if social media was going to be a net positive for society, I would have given you this, full-throated Netroots Nation answer about, how great social media was going to be for society. Obviously, I've lived since then, and the internet has changed, and we've seen a lot of things happen across the world, both positive and negative, with what social media can do. I tend to think of these platforms as largely agnostic, and how you use them is how effective they are for good or for bad. But back to your sort of specific question, I think that it's going to change, right? Like we already do organizing on WhatsApp. So we'll say, we want you to post a piece of content on Instagram. We also want you to message 5 WhatsApp groups that you're a member of, or send DMs to 10 people who also live in, California 1. So we're trying to think ahead about how will this sort of like shift away from social media, which I think is definitely happening. Like, to your point, folks are posting less. They're becoming more passive consumers of content. I think things like YouTube and TikTok kind of like lend to like a more passive sort of approach. And like, I use TikTok a lot, but I almost never post because it's just a barrier to posting is just too high. It's like takes too much time to make a nice TikTok video for me to do. But then there are just other ways people are communicating. Look, there's audio. Like we work with podcasters. We work with, folks who have big email lists. So I think that there will always be folks who have an audience, and, figuring out how to organize those people around a message is, still going to be the way forward. But the platforms are going to obviously shift.
Definitely. And I think even just in this short conversation, my the knowledge of the sophistication of what's going on in the creator space has, I think I've leveled up, and hopefully our listeners have as well. So Ryan, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great, Michael.
I've just been speaking with Ryan Davis, Chief Operating Officer and co-founder at People First. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, we'll be taking more of an academic focus on the state of the art in browser tracking research with Professor Sebastian Stier from GESIS. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.